Good afternoon. My name is Gina Cheverine, Managing Vice President of Inclusion and Strategic Partnerships here at Greater Cleveland Partnership, and I'll be serving as moderator for this afternoon's webinar. Today's webinar is part of our But What Does It Mean series, a webinar series devoted to translating research studies and data into meaningful action. This session focuses on Greater Cleveland's inclusive economic performance and the business community's role in advancing racial equity. Our presenters from Brookings will cover several of their recently released reports, including the 2021 edition of Brookings Metro Monitor, which provides localized data on the Cleveland metro area's performance on inclusive economic growth and prosperity, as well as their report, How CEOs Can Help Power an Inclusive Recovery. We want to make sure that today's presentation is valuable for you, so we ask that you submit all questions by clicking on the question button in the control panel and typing your question there. Now, I'd like to introduce our speakers, Alan Berube and Reniya Dinkins. Alan is Senior Fellow and Deputy Director at the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings. In this role, he coordinates and amplifies research from across Brookings Metro on how to strengthen economic opportunity in regions, cities, and communities. Alan has also authored dozens of Brookings publications on economic and demographic trends in metropolitan areas, social policies affecting families and communities, and the role of cities in a globalizing economy. Reniya is a Senior Research Assistant in the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program. In partnership with Program Vice President and Director Amy Liu, Reniya conducts research and analysis on inclusive local economic growth and the intersection of economic, workforce, and community development policies. Our presenters have a wealth of information to share with you, and so I'll now turn it over to Alan to start our program.
Great, thank you so much, Gina. It's wonderful to be with you all today, have the chance to talk about some of the work that we've been doing at Brookings, and to rise to the challenge of this webinar series to actually talk about what we really think this means for regions like your own. Without further ado, let me talk to you a little bit about what I'm going to talk about, as well as give you a little bit of a hint as to what Reniya is going to talk about. We're going to sort of tag team this presentation and each talk about a recent report that we've co-authored that we think has important implications for the Cleveland area. So first off, I'm going to discuss results from our annual Metro Monitor publication, in particular, what it says about progress towards racial economic inclusion in Cleveland over the past decade. And after that, Reniya is going to discuss insights from her recent report with our colleague Amy on how CEOs can advance racial equity in their regional economies. And hopefully the first part will tee up the second part, but we'll let you be the judge of that. So to begin, I want to share a couple quick insights from our Metro Monitor for the Cleveland region. And the Metro Monitor, yes.
Can you change your display settings?
Oh, sure. How is that?
Yep, thank you.
Better, thank you. So the Metro Monitor is our annual assessment of the state of economic growth, prosperity, and inclusion in the nation's metropolitan areas. It examines each metro area's progress on these goals and then how they compare to one another. So the data in the monitor help to define economic success in a way that recognizes the importance of economic growth for expanding opportunities for workers and for businesses, but it also recognizes that growth is a means rather than an end. And true economic development also means increasing the average productivity and value of the local economy over time so that it creates better jobs, and that's what we call prosperity. And it means ensuring that residents benefit from that growth regardless of their income, their race, or their place. And that's what we call inclusion. So in the monitor, we operationalize this definition of inclusive growth through 5 categories of indicators, 15 indicators overall. Those are shown here. Don't want you to memorize them. What I want you to take away, in particular, as regards this presentation, is that we break out inclusion into these 3 categories on the right-hand part of the slide. The first of those categories focuses on overall inclusive outcomes. Essentially, that's the degree to which workers in the bottom half of the economic distribution are benefiting from economic trends over time. The second category examines outcomes for white workers versus workers of color, and we call that racial inclusion. And then the third category, geographic inclusion, looks at how disparities between wealthy neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods change over time. And in racial and geographic inclusion, positive outcomes are those that narrow longstanding gaps between people and places. We measure these outcomes over a 10-year period for 192 metropolitan areas in the United States that have at least 250,000 residents. And in this edition of the Metro Monitor, that 10-year period goes from 2009, so essentially really the depth of the Great Recession, to 2019, really the peak of the pre-pandemic economy. So this slide in turn shows the percentage, so from 0 to 100, of the 192 metropolitan areas that made positive progress on each of those 15 indicators. So just a quick snapshot here, you're seeing in general positive outcomes across growth, prosperity, and overall inclusion, pretty widespread in those categories, positive progress. The exception you'll see in the sort of bottom left-hand corner of the slide on jobs at young firms, that's our measure of entrepreneurship, and those jobs were still down in many metropolitan areas compared even to levels during the Great Recession. And I think we have every reason to expect that the pandemic recession is going to knock back entrepreneurship further, at least for some time, for most metropolitan areas. On racial and geographic inclusion, however, what I want to point out is that progress was spottier. And that's because in many metropolitan areas, over that 10-year period, people of color and poor neighborhoods posted some progress, but not nearly as much as white workers and already wealthy and advantaged neighborhoods. Turning to Cleveland's story over the 2010s, it too was mixed. So this slide shows where the Cleveland region ranked in each Metro Monitor dimension among the 53 metropolitan areas in the United States that have populations of over 1 million, like the Cleveland region. So not surprisingly, the region remained among the slowest growing big regions of the country, and it ranks similarly in that respect to regions such as Pittsburgh, Buffalo, Chicago, Milwaukee, other parts of the Midwest. But the regional economy actually increased more significantly in its average value, suggesting that, at least on net, the jobs that the Cleveland region gained in the 2010s were higher productivity and higher wage than the jobs that it shed. This is also actually the pattern in other manufacturing regions like Buffalo, Detroit, and in other dynamic markets around the country like Denver and Minneapolis too. Cleveland performed even more strongly relative to its peers on overall inclusion, as did a lot of other metropolitan areas in that part of the country. And I think this really reflects in large measure how much the Great Recession had driven down employment and incomes for vulnerable workers by 2009. The Midwest then, and Cleveland as well, managed to bounce back from those effects by the latter part of the decade. The region's performance on racial inclusion, however, wasn't as strong relative to its peers. And this was different than in other metropolitan areas in the Midwest that performed somewhat better. So this slide begins to dig into what's behind that ranking, that lower ranking for Cleveland on racial inclusion in the 2010s. So the first thing that this slide shows and that I want to point out is that relative to their position in 2009, workers of color in the Cleveland area, about 70% of those workers are Black, African American, made progress over the 2010s. So the share of adults of color in jobs increased, that employment rate on the left-hand side. Their median earnings increased in that middle part of the chart. And their relative poverty rate, that's the share earning less than half of the typical regional wage, dropped. So all positive outcomes there. However, the region's white population also made progress on each of those indicators. So the significant disparities that separate white workers and workers of color in the Cleveland area remain large by the end of the decade. And actually, in the case of earnings, again, in the middle part of the slide here, that disparity actually widened. So while median inflation-adjusted earnings for workers of color, as you can see, increased by about $3,500 over the decade, from $24,200 to $27,900, those for white workers increased by about $5,500, from $34,700 to $40,100. So that the result of all that was that by 2019, the typical white worker in the Cleveland area earned $12,000 more per year than the typical worker of color. And as the right-hand side chart shows, they were 30% less likely to earn low wages, as indicated by their lower relative poverty rate. There are, of course, many factors that contribute to these racial economic disparities, and each of those is rooted in long-standing systemic and systematic patterns of racial exclusion. One particularly important factor for Cleveland, though, that I want to shed light on, because I think it connects to some of the themes that Reniya is going to talk about in her part of the presentation today, is what labor economists call occupational segregation. So in the Cleveland region, as in many, many others, workers are not distributed evenly by race across different types of jobs. You have disparities in educational attainment, racial discrimination in hiring, unequal geographic access to jobs, and social networks and how they operate mean that workers of color are overrepresented in some fields and they are underrepresented in others. So in this chart, racial representation is shown on the vertical axis. So if white workers and workers of color were distributed evenly across occupations, all of the bubbles would be on the horizontal line. They'd all be at exactly 1. But as you can see, they're not. Workers of color are twice as likely to work in healthcare support jobs like home health aides and nurses' aides as the population overall. That's the uppermost bubble on the chart. And they're less than half as likely to work in legal occupations as the population overall. That's the lowermost bubble on the chart. The other dimension of inequality that we show in this chart here is wages. So if all occupational fields paid the same, all of the bubbles would be clustered on the vertical axis at that regional median wage, which is about $21 an hour for the Cleveland metropolitan area. But as you can see, they're not. The median wage in management fields, that rightmost bubble on the chart, is $50 an hour. But the median wage in food preparation and serving occupations, the leftmost bubble, is less than $11 an hour. And you can see between these two dimensions of inequality, there's a very clear pattern here. The fields where workers of color are overrepresented, where the bubble is above the horizontal axis, are largely the fields that pay low wages, where the bubble is to the left of the vertical axis. Moreover, these are fields that employ a lot of workers of color, and that's represented by the larger size of those bubbles in that part of the chart. Food service, healthcare support, transportation, office administrative support, even production jobs, which in the Cleveland area pay median wages of only about $18 an hour. By contrast, you've got higher paying white collar fields like computer and mathematical jobs, architecture and engineering, business, financial, sciences, education, even construction. They all employ relatively lower shares of workers of color. So this, I want to stress again, this isn't the only factor that reproduces racial inequalities in the Cleveland area, but I think it's a really important one that has implications for how local leaders create better pathways into the region's higher paying growth sectors to ensure a more diverse, a more equitable pool of talent that takes advantage of all of the great talent that you have in the Cleveland area. So that's the end of my part, my formal part of the presentation. And I'm going to pause here, hopefully, and take some comments, questions, and maybe chat a little bit with you, Gina, about what this is all showing before turning it over to Reniya. And that's my dog in the background, if you can hear that, just proving that indeed I'm at home.
Good to have another participant on the webinar. So, well, thank you. That really helps give us a good overview, and there's a lot more data to dive into if you go to the Metro Monitor, and you can slice and dice the data in a lot of different ways. But one of the things I'm curious about is, do you have a sense of how these data sets might change as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, so very good question, and recognizing the fact that the data that are in this edition of the Monitor really stop at 2019 at that peak of the economy. So I think what the pandemic has wrought, specifically in terms of economic inclusion and racial inclusion, is still coming into focus. We don't have quite the same kinds of data yet around those topics that we have through 2019, and that's just due to the lag and the kinds of census data that we employ for the Monitor. But we have some pretty strong signals. So I would say that in terms of the kind of more macro things going on in the Cleveland economy during the pandemic, we run another research effort at Brookings Metro called the Metro Recovery Index, and we essentially benchmark these same metropolitan areas, these same 192 places, on indicators of the labor market, real estate, and sort of general levels of economic activity, and see how they're doing sort of relative to national baselines and to one another. And I think the story for the Cleveland area is that it has been affected worse than some places and not as badly as others. It's sort of in the middle of the pack in terms of the decline in the number of jobs from its pre-pandemic baseline, its unemployment rate, what's going on with travel into the area, activity in the commercial real estate market and the home buyer market. So I think there's not a reason to think that you all have been more or less affected than the kind of national average as the pandemic goes. What it doesn't shed a lot of light on, that index at least, is what's going on with communities of color in particular and more vulnerable workers. But we know from a lot of national and actual state-based data sets as well that the most vulnerable have been the most affected in the pandemic. And for those of you who follow this stuff, it lines up, right? The industries most affected by the pandemic have been many consumer-facing industries that pandemic-related restrictions have had very deleterious effects on: leisure and hospitality, food service, retail, all industries that disproportionately employed lower wage workers, workers of color, workers who faced more economic challenges to begin with. And so I don't have any reason to think, especially seeing those occupational segregation statistics for the Cleveland area, that those communities have been more or less insulated from the crisis. If anything, I think they may be more exposed to the crisis because of those patterns in a region like Cleveland than elsewhere. So for our part, and I hope this is the case for your region and public and private leaders in your region, I think it's a real reminder to think first and foremost about equity and equity considerations as you plan for the recovery and you measure the recovery and you measure your success in the recovery. Thinking about who was actually affected by the downturn is really paramount.
Thank you. I had another question about, you've had engagement with Northeast Ohio, you know us pretty well, and based on your work in other regions, what efforts might you suggest that we explore to continue to address racial disparities as we come out of the recovery?
It's a great opportunity to flack more of our work at Brookings Metro. So actually a bunch of months ago, actually sort of towards the end of last summer, when we're really still in the thick of the pandemic, we published a series of sort of actionable ideas that cities and regions could take on to ensure a more equitable recovery from the crisis, focusing on what we believe are the key pillars of inclusive economic development. That is sort of creating good jobs, sort of bumping up that prosperity number over time, making sure that you're gaining jobs and strength in sectors that pay good wages and keep you competitive. preparing a diverse talent pool for those jobs, and then ensuring geographic, physical access to those jobs for communities that have too often been left behind and found themselves in the wrong part or on the wrong side of the region from where opportunity lies. So I would recommend folks go to our Metro COVID-19 Recovery Watch website, gain access to not only those sort of specific policy recommendations, which range from industry advancement services, working with small and mid-sized businesses, particularly more in the services sector, to help them improve their productivity and their hiring practices so they can hire based not on signals of skills, but on the real skills that workers bring, regardless of their credentials from colleges and universities, to digital equity offices at the municipal level that can work hand in hand with affected communities who lack digital access, and private sector providers build that bridge that improves not only access but affordability, and a range of other case studies from regions around the country. But I think the important thing is through all that, sort of embracing equity and racial equity as an ethic that informs how you do all of those things, the creation, the preparation, and the access to. I think there are great things going on in Cleveland right now. We've been following the Cleveland Innovation Project really closely, and I think that effort embraces a lot of those principles too. And I think reaching for scale around that, and right now in particular taking advantage of all of the new flexible federal fiscal resources that are flowing directly into cities and counties is perhaps a once in a generation opportunity.
Yeah, so it's good to hear you say that, because definitely some of the things that you're talking about we have started, and the digital divide being one of them, as well as the Cleveland Innovation Project. So let's put a pin in that, and I would like to send it over to Reniya so she can walk through her presentation, and then we'll take some questions once she's done with hers.
Awesome. Am I unmuted, folks? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I'm gonna share my screen. Okay. All right, so I want to start by saying good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for having me. My name is Reniya Dinkins, and I'm excited to share with you all the insights from my recent report with Amy Liu, titled From Commitments to Action, How CEOs Can Advance Racial Equity in Their Regional Economies. So my plan is to cover three things today. First, I want to talk about how advancing racial equity in the private sector can make Cleveland a more economically competitive region. Second, I'm going to share the three-part framework for action highlighted in my report, along with some case study examples from around the country. And lastly, I'm going to close by sharing some metrics on Cleveland that can be useful for informing goals that the region can achieve to reduce racial disparities. So almost a year ago today, following the tragic death of George Floyd and several transformational protests around the country, I personally recall feeling extremely overwhelmed with mixed emotions as we yet again were faced with the question of how to best resolve the detrimental ways in which racism persists in all of its forms. And we know that the private sector can play a major role here, which is why it was good to see corporate leaders asking themselves what they could do. But as you all know, their statements condemning racism were met with scrutiny, several of them, as the public demanded more from companies both large and small that had the power to do more. And so as you can see here, Just Capital conducted a survey last June that found that while 3 in 4 Americans want corporate leaders to condemn racism, nearly 2/3 found corporate commitments hollow, perhaps even performative, without meaningful actions to back them up. So the big question over the past year has been, what is meaningful action? And a McKinsey report found that while a portion of top US companies made statements in support of racial justice, a smaller portion actually took action with external commitments, such as donations and strategic investments. And an even smaller portion took action with internal commitments, like requiring diverse candidate pools or increasing spend with Black suppliers. And so what I'm trying to say here is, while external commitments can mean a lot, If companies aren't looking at themselves, at their own business practices, at their products and services, at racial disparities in pay or in leadership among their employees, even at the impact of their physical location in cities and communities, and not questioning if they are failing to actively work against systemic racism as it may exist within themselves, the truth is that is complicity with the status quo. And it is clear by the numbers that the necessary internal work is not being done. And that may be for a long time because for a long time, addressing racism in the private sector was more of a social cause that called for donations, almost like charity, when in fact, internal shifts in business that promote racial equity can strengthen company bottom lines. Here we see that when thinking about talent attraction and retention, that 67% of job seekers consider diversity important when deciding where to work. Also, 43% of companies are more likely to experience higher profits when boards are culturally diverse. 40% of companies are more likely to make it safe to risk proposing novel ideas when they have diverse leadership, which makes them more likely to introduce new product innovations that appeal to wider, more diverse audiences. And 33% of companies are more likely to outperform their peers when executive teams have high cultural diversity. And so these here are just some of the ways that internal actions can make companies more competitive. And when we're thinking about regional business communities like Cleveland's, when the local companies that power the region's economy all commit to making these kinds of changes, it makes Cleveland's economy even stronger. So we also have to consider that the white population in the region is the only racial demographic that has shrunk over the past decade. And so this means that actively pursuing racial equity in the private sector is a must for the sake of Cleveland's future talent, consumer base, and communities. Okay, now I'm going to move to our framework for action. And we have a three-part framework for action here. First is individual action. Then we also have working collectively through a coalition of CEOs. And lastly is working with regional economic development organizations and CEO-driven organizations. And I just want to note here that 2 out of 3 of these call for group action, which can be really powerful when corporate leaders are looking to make their home regions more racially equitable. And so for this first part, individual action, we recommend that companies undertake an internal audit of their diversity, equity, and inclusion performance to ensure any public commitments to a just economy start from within. There are several resources for this, including a diversity, equity, and inclusion solutions audit created by Opportunity Hub. This is just an example of one that's aimed at firms in the tech startup and venture capital ecosystems. And so I just want to give a little background. The Opportunity Hub is a platform that works towards racial equity in tech, founded by Rodney Sampson, who's one of our key partners at Brookings Metro, and also a non-resident fellow at Brookings Metro, and he's pictured here. And the audit strategy that they have at Opportunity Hub, also known as OHUB, for employers includes a review of the extent to which DEI is operationalized in 6 different ways. First, in corporate boards and governance, also among hiring, promotion, and HR practices, in corporate procurement and vendor services, in corporate innovation and product development, so firms are developing ethical products and solutions that can meet the needs of a more diverse customer base, in the resources firms place on going to market and reaching more diverse audiences, and in the way firms invest in and empower Black and Latino or Hispanic businesses, programs, and communities through equity investments, partnerships, and philanthropy. And so I wanted to share one example of a small car insurance company based in Columbus, Ohio, not too far from Cleveland, that took meaningful individual action after evaluating how the way they do business may be perpetuating systems of inequality. Root Insurance recognizes that relying on credit scores causes certain groups of people to have to pay more for car insurance, including historically under-resourced communities. And as a result, they decided to eliminate credit scores from their pricing model to offer fair rates to drivers who've experienced financial hardships. Instead, they're basing rates primarily on driving behavior. Next, I want to share with you some examples of coalitions of regional CEOs working together to advance racial equity. In Birmingham, Alabama, Black businesses are significantly underrepresented, as you can see in this chart to the left. So while the region is 28% Black, only 3% of business owners are Black. And this is the largest racial disparity in business ownership among metro areas with more than 1 million people. And so essentially, it's one of the largest racial disparities in business ownership in the country. And Birmingham's mayor and several local CEOs saw this as a major problem and recognized the importance of strengthening and expanding minority, women, and other disadvantaged business enterprises in the region. And as a first step to improving, they launched the VITAL program, VITAL standing for Valuing Inclusion to Accelerate and Lift. And this was an effort to increase annual corporate spending with MWDBEs, that's what it stands for, minority, women, and other disadvantaged business enterprises. Starting this year, these CEOs are publishing an annual performance report on their spending with these businesses. And in addition, CEOs can also create coalitions at a state level, as seen in Washington state, where over 70 corporate leaders from various sectors, including Microsoft, Starbucks, and the Gates Foundation, formed a group called Washington Employers for Racial Equity. They're putting a total of $2 billion towards a set of shared goals to achieve by 2030, including fostering an inclusive corporate culture, achieving better representation of Black and brown workers and their workforce, their management, and their senior leadership, achieving racial parity in employee pay, creating more pathways to quality jobs for Black students, and increasing spend with Black businesses. And lastly, there are actions that corporate leaders can take through local organizations. So in Indianapolis, for example, the local Chamber of Commerce is partnering with a regional corporate partnership and also with several Indy CEOs to create a committee called Business Equity for Indy. And this committee is committed to expanding hiring, promotion, and leadership opportunities for the region's Black population and other people of color, expanding minority-owned business enterprises and procurement opportunities, and addressing health disparities in light of COVID. And so I'm hoping that seeing all of these efforts happening around the country is inspiring, and also has you thinking, okay, so what should the private sector here in Cleveland be focused on when it comes to advancing racial equity? And my advice, and something that I know that the Greater Cleveland Partnership does a great job with, is to use data and key metrics to inform your priorities and to set goals around. We saw, for example, how Birmingham fared poorly with business representation by the numbers. And as a result, their major CEOs are prioritizing how they can support the growth of local Black businesses. When it comes to strengthening the regional economy with actions that advance racial equity, our report encourages CEOs to at least start with looking at how their region is performing with proportional and racial representation in key occupations and their talent, in supplier diversity, and in neighborhood wealth gaps. And so I have here Cleveland's data on racial and ethnic representation in management roles and in computer and math occupations. I spoke earlier on how racial diversity in management roles can improve company performance, but I also have computer and math occupations here because tech represents the fastest growing parts of the economy, which makes it key in considering who the workers are driving that and who it's serving and not serving. And so as you can see, Black workers make up nearly 18% of Cleveland's workforce, but only 9.2% of management roles and 10.5% of computer and math occupations are filled by Black workers. And with Hispanic and Latino workers, who make up 5.5% of the region's workforce, only 3.9% of management roles and 3% of computer and math jobs are filled by Hispanic and Latino workers. When ranked up against other metro areas with populations that exceed 1 million, so when ranked up against essentially its peers, Cleveland ranks low on Black representation, 44 out of 51 on management representation, and 29 out of 51 on computer and math job representation. And the slightly better on Hispanic and Latino representation, Cleveland ranks 12 out of 52 on management and 22 out of 52 on computer and math job representation. And so I'll also, the reason why these numbers are different with 51 and 52, there are 53 metro regions with over 1 million people in their population, but this was with metro areas where the data is available. So data is available for Black workers in 51 and for Hispanic and Latino and 50 workers in 52. And so to kind of shift towards Black-owned businesses, one of our scholars at Brookings, Andre Perry, did an analysis of Black-owned employer businesses in metro areas around the country. And his data shows that while 21.6% of Cleveland's metro population is Black, only 2% of employer businesses are Black-owned. And so, of course, if the region's employer businesses better reflected the Black population, it would undoubtedly make Cleveland's economy stronger, especially if they were well represented in high growth industries. And of course, it would also expand wealth opportunities for Black business owners and their employees. And so when we're thinking about supplier diversity and how we can support Black-owned businesses in the region, we can start with metrics like these in order to set goals. And just for context, Cleveland does rank low on this nationally compared to the 112 other metro areas where there is data available from the Census Bureau's annual business survey. Cleveland ranks 101. Lastly, we know that private sector actors have systemically undervalued majority Black neighborhoods with clear market assets and incomes. And this is seen with home and business devaluation in Black neighborhoods, as well as with conventional resale establishments underserving majority Black neighborhoods, even Black neighborhoods with high household incomes, which hurts market attractiveness. And so Brookings has reports on all of these with data to back this up. And just as they have the power to hurt Black neighborhoods, they also have the power to strengthen them by investing in their assets. And so while this isn't a perfect measure for benchmarking progress on this front by any means, considering that struggling neighborhoods are often disproportionately overwhelmingly people of color, it is on the national level, not sure about in the Cleveland region. But one proxy for progress is closing the income gap between the most advantaged and disadvantaged neighborhoods in a metro area through actions like private investment, product development, and corporate philanthropy. And so data from the Metro Monitor that Alan just presented on shows that in Cleveland, the median income household gap between the top and bottom neighborhood tracts has increased by 2% over the past decade, which is not great. But the private sector can help to close this gap by taking actions that invest in community wealth building opportunities, ensuring that there are more vibrant, thriving neighborhoods of color. So I want to close with a quote from a group called Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And so it says, racial equity develops goals and outcomes that will result in improvements for all groups, but the strategies are targeted based on the needs of a particular group. Systems that are failing communities of color are actually failing all of us. Targeted universalism will increase our collective success and be cost effective. And so even though this is a quote from a government collective, it also applies here when thinking about the corporate sector, when thinking about the private sector. And I put it here to remind us again of the importance of contextualizing racial equity in the private sector, not just as something that helps Black folks or Hispanic and Latino folks, but as something that helps us all. Because the fact of the matter is the status quo at this given moment is holding us back from being stronger and better, but we wouldn't know because we've never lived in a nation where racism truly is no more. And so I'm hoping this context informs the kinds of actions private sector leaders take and the urgency of this moment to truly advance racial equity in Cleveland and in metro areas across the nation. I'm going to close there and stop screen sharing. Oh, let's see. I'm gonna sharing, sorry folks. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Reniya. And you know, I had an opportunity to really dive deep into your report and a lot of great things in there. And one of the suggestions is that executives can certainly do work within their organizations, but there's even more power when they work together for systematic impact. And GCP, as well as a number of our colleagues in the economic development ecosystem, we have some initiatives, but sometimes we struggle with gaining buy-in further than the statements that you talked about at the beginning. So do you have suggestions on how to engage and encourage the private sector, that they really do play a significant role in creating these collective solutions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a big part of it is what you said in the beginning, Reese. We're talking about doing things in a collective, in a group. with your peers. I think, of course, like it's a shame when a lot of people don't want to because, you know, there might be risks involved, but at the same time, the approach of doing work in community and with your peers within a region has a goal of engaging more people. There's power in numbers. That's been seen with Georgia and with the CEOs that have come out and made statements about voting legislation down there, but it can definitely be applied here. And I think I know a lot of the apprehension can also come from not knowing where to start or being afraid of doing the wrong thing and being canceled by by the public. And but I think when CEOs and private sector leaders, you know, first equip themselves with the knowledge of how they can do better and also work in tandem with other organizations and with the community in their own regions, with Black community, with Hispanic and Latino communities in their region, in order to really educate themselves and inform themselves on the best next steps forward, which I know a lot of CEOs are doing right now and have been doing over the past year. Then that hope of like seeing all of your peers do it in order to improve regional performance, you know, because clearly, like in my case, I state that it does improve regional economic performance, will make them want to buy in as well. I think a big part of it is also the framing. I think that when we frame this as something that is an urgent matter where the region's economy is at stake, I think it kind of causes folks to think, oh, this is something that's not just like a social cause in the way that we've been looking at it for the past few decades, but this is something that is also, racism is holding the economy back. And essentially, if we're framing it that way, then I think that it creates a bigger desire for action.
Yeah, we definitely talk a lot within our division about the message that we need to put out. And you're right that peer pressure is often a great driver as well. I'm curious, kind of a follow-up to that, what's the most ambitious initiative that you've seen? You went through and provided some great examples for us. Is there something that, you know, a region has done that's kind of blown you away and like, wow, that's really stepping out of the box?
I mean, I think it depends on where a region is not performing well. Like, I think that sometimes of course, for me, like, I like to contextualize this as regional efforts. I guess when I'm thinking about individual efforts of companies, we saw a few of them last year. I think one of my favorites was Root Insurance, just because it's a small company based in Columbus, Ohio, and they just said, we're getting rid of credit scores. And that's pretty cool. But I also think that those are the types of actions that start with small companies. When they are able to carry it out well and to show that like it is good for business, it sets a model for larger companies across the nation to also take that approach and see it as a safe bet that can also improve their business. So that's one of my favorites, which is why I included it in here. But also when I'm thinking about regional performance, I mean, I feel like I included a lot of mine in the presentation. I think that Birmingham's work is really great, specifically because in any region that's really using data to inform the goals and their priorities, I think is always super important. So that's why I really like Birmingham's approach of using data and seeing where they're really weak, and then really investing time and effort into that in order to strengthen themselves.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask Alan to come back on. We have plenty of time for questions, and we have a few that I'd like to pose to our group. And Reniya, we have one for you that says, how would you approach setting goals with a group of CEOs to advance support for minority businesses? Where would you begin the conversation? And that, you know, plays well onto what you just ended with.
Yeah, I mean, definitely starting with your date with the data, the local data, seeing, because I think, like, say if we're taking Cleveland, for example, we know that we want to, I guess, think about how to improve. I guess was the question about representation, or was it? spend, like minority business spend with supplier diversity?
How would you go about setting goals with a group of CEOs to advance support for minority business?
Support. Okay, yeah. Okay, so definitely, like I said, starting with the metrics, but I think when we're looking at Cleveland's data and it says that only 2% of employer businesses are Black owned, while 21.6% of the population is Black in the region. I think it means like, okay, by 2025, we're gonna increase the number of businesses, of Black owned employer businesses by X percent, and by 2030 by this percent, and really setting those strategic goals. There's also a really great effort in Cincinnati. Their Chamber of Commerce has a minority business accelerator headed by Darren Redis. He co-wrote a report with one of our scholars, Joe Barilla, a few months ago. And they're just doing excellent stuff by really focusing on, I think, high growth sector industries and taking a small cohort and then using the chamber's resources, including their relationships with some of the largest and most successful companies in the region, to pour into small and growing minority-owned businesses. So I definitely recommend looking at their model.
And just to add to what Reniya said, we're working with some folks in Indianapolis on kind of wider dashboard for inclusive economic growth for Marion County and for the region. But that's a tool that can encompass and add prominence and investment to efforts like those represented in business equity for Indy, which Reniya talked about in her presentation, so that the goal of increasing investment in minority suppliers and other minority-owned small businesses connects to a wider regional effort to reduce racial inequalities, increase equitable racial opportunity. And I would shout out my friends at the Fund for Economic Future and their Two Tomorrows framework and the kinds of outcomes that they track through that, which I think are exactly the right kinds of aspirations for a region that can in turn connect to goals, not only for public policy and public policy efforts and public sector efforts, but also for the kinds of private sector actions that we've been talking about today too.
Yeah, we have definitely used the Two Tomorrows report to drive some of our work. And Reniya, you're right. We also look at Cincinnati. They are well known, and we keep an eye on what they're doing. So appreciate that as well. Alan, I'm going to go to a question for you. We have one that says, how might we use the American Rescue Plan and other federal investments to reduce occupational segregation and increase wages?
Terrific question. So for those who haven't followed it quite as closely, or might know something about it, just level set that the American Rescue Plan is the $2.2 trillion package enacted by Congress and the Biden administration back in mid-March. And it has lots and lots of different programs within it. Some are for individual households and families, so the stimulus checks, the increase to the child tax credits, and really meaningful things to reduce the economic hardships that many vulnerable households are facing right now. But there's as well a very significant tranche of funding that goes to local governments and state governments and other kinds of public and private sector agencies and intermediaries. The most prominent, if you're in Cleveland or cities like Cleveland, the most prominent part of that funding is probably the $130 billion that it provides directly to cities and counties. So Congress in its infinite wisdom said, we'll give half to cities and half to counties. So they each get $65 billion. But the upshot of that is that most cities and counties around the country, a portion of those funds are going to help them offset some of the budget gaps that they encountered due to the pandemic and the revenue losses associated with that. But once those are addressed, they're left with considerable number of flexible dollars to deploy to meet the challenges posed by the pandemic crisis, which could be almost anything almost any economic challenge that cities and regions are facing right now, anything under the sun. And together with those flexible funds, there are a wide number of categorical programs in the package to help school districts, local infrastructure, including broadband internet access, workforce programs, and public health needs as well. So I think the smart regions are going to be those that take their flexible allocations from the American Rescue Plan package, match those with the categorical programs that sometimes go to the cities and their agencies, but often go to the local school district or the local public health agency. Sometimes they go to the state and then flow down to local jurisdictions in the region. And pick 3 or 4 big things that, in the case of occupational segregation, leverage those dollars to provide rapid turnaround training and preparation for careers that communities of color might not have had historic access to. In particular, the degree to which those communities have been in the kinds of fields and occupations and industries that have been severely affected by the crisis, like leisure and hospitality, that are not going to recover right away, right? They're going to take a long time to turn around. But there are real near-term needs in fields like health, sciences, technology. There are a lot of resources in this plan to arm communities with the kinds of resources, stand up the kinds of partnerships, public-private, that they need, engage local colleges, universities, and community colleges in the effort, and leave these communities, in fact, better off with better opportunities than they might have had even before the crisis displaced many of them. So I would love to see regions like Cleveland put a big down payment on really opening the floodgates for opportunities in those growth sectors of the economy, good paying jobs, advancement opportunities that could really set the region on a new trajectory from some of the statistics that we've been seeing today.
Great, thank you. We did get another question. So can you discuss strategies you're seeing in other cities that have successfully incentivized investment from the private sector in historically disinvested communities? So kind of a tag on to what you were talking about.
Sure, I'll go first, and maybe Reniya will want to add on to it. So again, to flack our own stuff, but my colleagues Jennifer Vey and Tracy Lowe, who work in our Bass Center for Transformative Placemaking at Brookings Metro, have written about these interesting new models emerging in places like Los Angeles and Kansas City. And I think there are folks looking at this seriously in Cleveland as well for what they call community investment trusts. So these are essentially REITs, but for low-income communities, and give residents of low-income communities a chance to invest not necessarily at the bottom of the market, but it is true that the commercial real estate has been hit harder in the pandemic downturn than residential real estate. But when the economy picks up, I think we should expect to see increased demand for consumers and businesses, and thus the potential for appreciation in prices in communities really at the margin that are ready to take off. But rather than this just be another edition of the same old story where private investment sort of crowds out historically underrepresented populations, communities, businesses in these commercial corridors, to give residents of these communities a real piece of the action, community investment trusts are a really new and powerful vehicle for doing that. I think, right, like finding opportunities for the private sector to invest in these communities is one thing, but finding opportunities for them to invest in it that actually redound to the benefit of long-term residents of these communities, long-term small businesses serving these communities, that's the secret sauce. And so I would really commend viewers to the work that they've done, which lays out both a kind of state policy agenda for creating these kinds of vehicles, and then in turn ways that we could use these new resources from the federal government under the American Rescue Plan Act to prime the pump for these same community investment trusts.
I think Alan hit the nail on the head when thinking about incentivizing private sector investments in communities. I can speak maybe a little bit more on investing in people. So I know in Indianapolis, two of our fellows here at Brookings Metro worked and put out a report called Opportunity Industries that found that essentially, let me just put it this way. I think their report on opportunity industries caused the Indianapolis government, including their mayor and several other folks, to look at themselves and say, oh, wow, we could be doing a better job with bringing better industries into our region. And so but not only bringing better industries, but industries that offer quality jobs to their residents. And so they have a new incentive, or they created an incentive for companies they would get a tax break if their minimum wage was $18 or more for their workers. And this does essentially still help communities, I think, in the region in order to bring income, like household income levels up in some of maybe the lowest earning communities in the region. But I think investing in people, investing in communities, it's all, full circle. So I just want to flag that example as well.
I appreciate that add-on for sure. Well, we are coming up on time, and so I wanted to make sure that each of you had an opportunity to close out if there's anything else you wanted to add for our audience. So Alan, we'll start with you and then go to Reniya.
Sure. Well, first, I just wanted to thank you, Gina, and the partnership for hosting us today for an important conversation. Important, I think, opportunity for Reniya and me to reflect on what our research actually means when it comes to the case of a region that we really care about and know pretty well, like Cleveland. And the last example I'd sort of offer, because I think it's pertinent to regions like yours, and is something that I think, again, the current moment around federal resources offers the opportunity to rethink, is how to do economic development in a way that really advances economic and racial inclusion. There are great examples, again, of work that we profile, but is being done in communities like Chicago, again, Cincinnati, and others that focus on the missing middle of businesses that have, say, 10 to 100 employees. And I think you have more of those in the Cleveland area than the typical metropolitan area, certainly than a metropolitan area like Washington, D.C., where Reniya and I live. But really focusing on how to equip those businesses with the sorts of management practices that are not only good for competitiveness and growing and retaining good jobs, but hiring diverse talent and training that talent and giving these communities that need better access to good paying growth sectors the chance at those jobs and the chance for advancement in those jobs and the chance to own businesses in those sectors of the economy. We call this industry advancement services. But there are a wide array of, I think, innovative and promising practices that I think this is the time to rethink what we call business retention and expansion in a way that actually provides competitiveness, prosperity, and inclusion in that missing middle of the economy too.
And I'll just close by saying that I want to recognize the Greater Cleveland Partnership and the work that you all do. I think it's excellent. I know the work that you all are doing around Black women's health and well-being in the Cleveland metro region is very just like on point. You all are using data to inform your own goals. And so I just want to encourage the private sector in the region to continue finding this important and setting even more goals around this and working in tandem together across sectors to achieve a better future for the region and for the nation as a whole.
Great. Well, thank you to both of you. Really appreciate your insights, the data, all of it. I know that the folks who are participating will definitely be able to take some of your insights to heart. So I want to hope that everyone found the webinar engaging and informative, and if you have thoughts, please let us know. You'll be getting a survey, and we do hope that you will fill that out and let us know how else we can provide useful webinars for you. And with that, we will say thank you so much for joining us.